Good evening. Thank you so much for coming today, and welcome to the Daniels faculty. My name is Aziza Shaouni, and I'm an associate professor of architecture here, and I want to thank you for attending the events today, which is actually the kickoff. Sorry, I'm looking for the mouse. Which is actually the kickoff for a symposium on modern heritage in Toronto, which is an event long overdue. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge, as a settler in this country, this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and as many of you may know, the name of the avenue on which our faculty sits, Spadina, comes from the Anishinaabe and means a place on a hill. The site was also part of an important trail for several First Nations. As an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we note this history with gratitude and wish to honor these connections as we move forward together. Now, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the World Monuments Fund, particularly Javier Ors-Osen, the director of the Modern Program at WMF, Michael Piper, director of the Daniels Event Committee, the communication teams at Daniels, and the activist groups Ontario Place for All and Save the Science Centre for their support. Before diving into the event, I would like to begin with a brief homage to the late George Baird. George was my professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, my dean when I first joined the Daniels faculty back in 2008, a dear colleague and a generous mentor. Without his guidance, I would not be standing in front of you today. I am in debt to him on countless levels, one of which is his immense contribution to my understanding and appreciation of post-war 20th century heritage. His erudite yet humorous storytelling, phenomenal memory, and critical mind left an indelible mark on me. When I visited Toronto for my interview 16 years ago, it was my first time in the city. I vividly remember my one-to-one conversation with George in his office at 230 College Street. When he suggested a tour of the St. George campus, I accepted politely, but I couldn't resist asking if I could also visit the Scarborough campus, which I had admired from afar for years. His eyes lit up instantly. And he shared countless anecdotes about his favorite modern buildings, from the TD Centre to other Toronto's mid-centuries heritage. And he also highlighted its diversity, richness, international merit, and unfortunately, the negative perceptions it faced. A decade later, I had the privilege of working with George on the Future of Ontario Place initiative, alongside the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario and the World Monuments Fund. This collaborative project documented the unique history and architecture of Ontario Place, while raising awareness of its local and international heritage value. As the only water-bound megastructure from the 1960s and 70s to transition from drawing board to reality, Ontario Place remains a public space providing unparalleled lake access and leisure. Sadly, not for so long. With the ongoing desecration of the site, the Future of Ontario Place website now risks of becoming a virtual memory to Ebb Zeidler's and Michael Hough's modern masterpiece. You can see here Ontario Place as it used to be and Ontario Place as you can see it today, with the cutting of its trees and the demolition of its buildings. Indeed, a shame. Over the years, I exchanged stories about the modern buildings we cherished with George, his in Toronto and mine in post-colonial Morocco and Senegal. Despite the ocean that separates them, this mid-centuries heritage landmarks share a common ethos, a sense of monumentality, and what Banham famously called a physiognomy of manic optimism, and a profound belief in the transformative power of modernist architecture on society and politics. Yet these buildings and landscape face eerily similar threats, a lack of recognition and legal protection, neglect, and rampant obliteration driven by redevelopment pressures. Too often, modern heritage is dismissed as disposable, and its sites are seen as prime opportunities for urban densification. The statu quo stems not only from ignorance of their cultural and historical significance, but also from a failure to see their potential in shaping the sustainable, adaptive, and decarbonized cities of tomorrow. Thankfully, all is not bleak. Over the past decade, appreciation for mid-century modern heritage has grown, along with the rise of modern heritage conservation as a distinct practice. This shift owes much to James Marston Fitch, who created the preservation program at Columbia University in 1963 and pioneered in the 90s approaches to preserving the heritage of the recent past. Organizations like UNESCO, Docomomo, and also TISIC have also made strides in identifying, documenting, and promoting modern heritage across the globe. For instance, during the first 30 years of the World Heritage Convention, from 1972 to 2001, only 14 modern sites were listed, and by 2017, that number has grown to over 40, with many more nominations in progress. However, while international awareness is rising, Toronto lags behind. Despite efforts like the Heritage Register of the City of Toronto, the Toronto Modern Map by the TSA, the activism of Ontario Place for All and Save the Science Centre, and the work of journalists such as Alex Bozikovic and Elsa Lam, to name a few, Toronto's modern heritage remains at high risk. Landmarks have been demolished and are currently under threat or face significant alteration. This is the North Centre. Or they also face closure and probably demolition. Alarmingly, the precarious state of modern heritage today mirrors that of 1985, when the demolition of the Buldova Tower spurred the formation of activist groups like the Bureau of Architecture and Urbanism, which organized sit-ins, an exhibition, and a publication called Toronto Modern that was released in 1987. Fast forward 37 years, and we must ask ourselves, has the situation improved or worsened? Can we afford to demolish existing buildings and waste energy and resources, especially when the building sector accounts for 39% of global carbon emissions? How can Toronto recognize the cultural and economic value of its architectural heritage, as world-class cities have done? These pressing questions form the heart of this symposium. Tonight, we begin with the keynote lecture by esteemed urban planner and author and activist Ken Greenberg, followed by a short video from Associate Professor Bridget Shim, who unfortunately could not be with us today. Acting Dean Robert Levitt will then chair a roundtable discussion. Tomorrow, we will hold 3 sessions, one on successful case studies of modern heritage rehabilitation and adaptive reuse in Toronto. Second, going to be a session that's going to discuss 2 modern sites currently at risk, Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre. And finally, the 3rd session is going to focus on strategies to safeguard modern heritage in Toronto, and all this is going to culminate in a final roundtable to outline, hopefully, a roadmap for action for the city and its modern heritage. The full schedule and also the participant bios can be found on the Daniels webpage for this symposium that you can follow on this QR code here. It's gigantic, I know, so you don't even need to zoom. And also, in addition, we have put in place a platform for submitting questions live, and that is available immediately. It's on slido.com. You can just go to slido.com and put the code 341021, or you can use this QR code. And the goal is for us to get as much of your questions as possible. Even if we don't get the opportunity to answer them, hopefully we could be able to bring also some answers on the platform. So, to close, I would like to leave you with a quote from the Bureau of Architecture and Urbanism, extracted from the Toronto Modern publication from 1987 that's still very much relevant to us today. If we have not the confidence to look forward as well as back, future generations will find nothing we have built worth making in their turn to preserve. So without further ado, I invite Ken Greenberg to the stage. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I would like to thank Associate Professor Shaouni and Acting Dean Levitt for their invitation to open this symposium. It's really an honor. In 1996, author and critic Robert Fulford wrote a book about Toronto entitled Accidental City, and in some ways it is an apt description. From a small provincial city founded by the British at the end of the 18th century on the shores of Lake Ontario, we have found ourselves, to our own astonishment, to be perhaps the fastest growing city in North America and the fourth largest after Mexico City, New York, and Los Angeles. We are considered by the United Nations to be one of the most diverse in the world, if not the most diverse. Over half of us, like myself, were born in another country, and over half identify as visible minorities. So no majority population. You might say we are the MAGA Republicans' worst nightmare. We are experiencing massive change as we grow dramatically on the traces of earlier versions of ourselves, literally rising vertically on the footprint of the existing city and displacing it in a dense and radical urban transformation. A key part of that transformation was a wave of mid-20th century modernism in architecture, which we might say began with the opening in 1965 of the new City Hall and Nathan Phillips Square, a competition won by Finnish architect Viljo Ravel in 1958, which inspired a number of stellar works of civic architecture. It also marked the beginning of a period of great civic activism in the city as it redefined itself. Architects and landscape architects played leading roles, setting a new direction. As a young architect, I was recruited by one of our greatest mayors, David Crombie, to set up a division of architecture and urban design in City Hall, and ended up working there for 10 years under 3 mayors, overseeing issues related to design and balancing the old and the new. At that time, 3 beloved buildings were all on the chopping block. It's a little hard to believe. Old City Hall, Union Station, and St. Lawrence Market, all designated for demolition. All were saved, but things have changed. It is now the legacy of the wave of mid-20th century modernism which is most at risk. The reason this symposium is taking place is because of what is happening to Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre, and to try and understand why it happened and is continuing to happen before our eyes, and how such a tragedy could be avoided, and to reflect on how we can inspire action and offer a constructive path toward the preservation of modernist architecture. So why is it that mid-20th century modern architecture is so much at risk, while we as a society often go to great lengths to save artifacts of earlier periods? Why 19th century, early 20th century are somehow considered sacrosanct as heritage in Toronto, while mid-20th century works like Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre are not treated with the same degree of veneration and respect. I want to try to delve into why Toronto has disregarded its modern heritage and continues to do so, while the architecture community, many of whom are present here today, unfortunately watches more or less silently at best, resigned to the fact that nothing can be done. I believe there are 5 principal reasons. 1, res publica challenge, the provincial government distancing itself from the inspiration of Canada's centennial year and the vision of the Progressive Conservative Party of the day. 2, demolition by neglect. 3, the move to res privata, privatization and commercialization. 4, the 3 wise monkeys, or turning a blind eye. 5, our own failure to adequately make the case for protecting prized modernist landmarks like Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre. So first, the challenge to res publica, public things. Preservation is not just about the buildings and the landscape as physical objects, but also about the inspirations behind them. This deliberation about the threats to Ontario Place and Ontario Science Centre speaks to a much larger issue, a profound clash of values. The Progressive Conservative Party government of 1970, which commissioned these projects, bore little resemblance to the current version of that party. Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre were both products of Canada's centennial celebration, commissioned by Premiers John Robarts and Bill Davis. Remember that it was Premier Bill Davis who stood up in the Ontario legislature in 1972 and famously stopped the Spadina Expressway, saying, if you want to build a city for cars, build the expressway. If you want to build it for a city for people, stop it. Inspired by Expo 67, these leaders saw the importance of investing in groundbreaking designs to mark a significant national moment. They reached out to some of Canada's most notable designers. It was a moment of optimism, community pride, and embrace of a new world of exciting possibilities. Eberhard Zeidler's Ontario Place was a futuristic vision for a renewed public relationship with Lake Ontario in a setting where technology, culture, and nature were blended in the iconic pods and the Cinesphere, complemented by Michael Huff's visionary landscape. Similarly, Ray Moriyama's Ontario Science Centre was revolutionary in how it brought interactive science education to the public, nestled seamlessly into the Don Valley, designed to harmonize with its natural surroundings. It was a true democratic space where science could be explored. These revolutionary designs, which were emblematic of a visionary period of Canadian design, but they were disdained by the current provincial government, not just as artifacts, but for what they represented. They are now in the process of either being demolished or significantly disturbed, despite their historical and cultural value. They are seen as disposable. The political winds have shifted, and without strong advocacy, they are at risk of being lost, not just as buildings, but for the ideas they embodied. While we see, and I think I speak for many in this room, their preservation as an investment in cultural capital and about weaving these unique structures into the fabric of modern urban landscapes with multiple benefits that include identity, community pride, and economic returns through tourism and revitalization, the provincial government has portrayed their preservation as an obstacle to urban growth, job creation, and densification, and they hold the levers of power. Our current vulnerabilities with the province go back to the British North America Act of 1867, our Constitution, which made cities the quote-unquote creatures of the provinces in a largely rural country. And this has allowed for the provincial government to step in extraordinary ways, micromanaging the city. That unrestrained power has made that mid-20th century architectural legacy particularly vulnerable. In fact, the very idea of local democracy has been threatened in ways that don't allow for critical debates around heritage. Heritage legislation is weak and has been further weakened in light of the government's propensity to change the rules to suit its desired projects, and there is not much to be expected in that quarter. In short, we have a system which doesn't really value design, architectural legacy as a public good or take it into account. Second, demolition by neglect, a strategy. There has been a widespread strategy of pre-demolition by neglect and I should say by provincial governments on both sides of the aisle, and sometimes by developers to support claims of obsolescence and irrelevance. In the case of Ontario Place, a number of cabinet ministers and the Premier made statements almost immediately after their election in 2018 about the fact that Ontario Place was a ruin, that was almost nothing worth preserving, and everything was up for grabs. And similarly with the Ontario Science Centre, a litany of statements to the effect that the building was obsolete and expendable. Things that could have been repaired, like the roof and a critical bridge, were not. In both cases, this disparaging rhetoric followed a long period of neglect, of deferred maintenance and care, allowing the buildings to deteriorate. In a cold climate like ours, with ice and snow and extreme differences in temperature, buildings need ongoing care. What we were witnessing was deliberate disinvestment and a pre-demolition strategy. This became a case of self-fulfilling prophecy. For both Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre, deferred maintenance did lead to visible deterioration, leaks, structural issues, and outdated facilities. But this deliberate neglect was a way to undermine their perceived value, making them easier targets for redevelopment. The negative comments from government officials further swayed public opinion, positioning these iconic structures as burdens rather than assets. By allowing buildings and landscapes to fall into disrepair, the government shaped public perception, portraying them as obsolete and ripe for removal. This tactic undermines the value of these projects and sites, creating an easier pathway to justify their destruction and radical transformation. Third, res privata as the alternative vision. Another reason for the destruction of modern heritage in Toronto is the ideologically driven philosophy of res privata, the imperative to privatize public places and public institutions, a now pervasive pattern. The Therm Mega Spa at Ontario Place is a textbook example. An extraordinary effort has been made to fundamentally divert Ontario Place from its original mission and aspirations for public lakefront access for all into a commercial attraction and drastically shrink the Ontario Science Centre. It makes little sense except when seen through the lens of an ideological-driven pivot, and these modern structures are collateral damage. It makes even less sense when seen through the lens of economics, since Ontario Place would have become, if rehabilitated and revitalized, and I'm talking about the landscape as well as the structures, a major tourist landmark, as one of the only ensembles in the world to mix metabolist architecture and ecologically inspired landscape design, those currents into a unique synthesis. And this was already happening prior to 2018 with Trillium Park and plans to extend it. I'm not going to go into all the draconian measures employed to turn over this valuable piece of the Toronto waterfront to private interests, the suspensions of all of the government's own laws governing planning, environment, and yes, heritage, the lack of transparency, the wall of intimidating non-disclosure agreements, the backroom dealings, and legislation preemptively holding the government harmless in the case of malfeasance. We may learn more about all this with the release of the Provincial Auditor General's report, which will delve into how this deal with Therm for the mega spa was arrived at and the procedures used by the provincial government to make this decision. The lease for the Therm Spa at Ontario Place in Ontario is structured as a 95-year lease, starting with a 75-year term, and the option for an additional 20 years. A century? Seriously? And the parking. The government, among other things, is obliged to provide 1,800 parking spaces with plans to build a garage, a 5-story garage with 2,500 spaces. This in a location served by all-day GO commuter rail, the waterfront LRT, and the new Ontario Line subway. And if this parking isn't available by the time the mega spa opens, the province, in other words, we as taxpayers, will face stiff financial penalties. Suffice it to say that there are serious concerns about the transfer of valuable public waterfront land to a private commercial facility, the environmental impact of the development, and the after-the-fact so-called public consultation. The development has faced backlash from the public across the province for its potential disruption to local wildlife and the brutal destruction of 850 50-year-old trees on the West Island, although Therm has committed to creating 16 acres of new public parkland and shoreline improvements. This is largely on the roof of an immense structure the size of BMO Field, dwarfing Ebbs-Idler's Pods, with a miniaturized science center pavilion sandwiched between it and a vast expansion of the Budweiser stage. The mega spa's business model is predicated on extraordinarily high visitation numbers, with targets as ambitious as 5 to 6 million visitors a year, around 15,000 per day, far greater than most major tourist attractions in the world. And the projected economic benefits to the province, including an estimated $2 billion in revenue over 95 years, rely heavily on these optimistic attendance numbers. All the economic assumptions regarding attendance and revenue projections for the Therm Spa are highly questionable. Ontario Place for All, a highly motivated citizen-led group which came together around the defense of Ontario Place, has conducted a review that suggests that the spa would significantly underperform financially. Even in the government's own narrowed commercial terms, it just doesn't add up. Fourth, the three wise monkeys: see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. The Ontario Association of Architects does not allow architects to criticize the work of registered architects, which makes criticism or even discussion extremely difficult. People have been threatened with lawsuits and feel muzzled. This leads, unfortunately, to the disengagement of the architecture community from all matters related to the province for fear of retaliation. The extensive use of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, is another means of ensuring acquiescence. Here is a telling clause which is inserted in most contracts of those working for the provincial government, and I quote, "In addition, the signatory agrees to refrain from directly or indirectly making disparaging, derogatory, inflammatory, negative, or critical comments or statements about employer, including not limited to employer's former and current officers, employees and or contractors and projects engaged in by the employer, as well as employer stakeholders, including but not limited to the Ministry of X, whichever ministry is in play here, the Office of the Premier, and or other governmental stakeholders. This includes, but is not limited to, publishing, posting, or otherwise disseminating or communicating any such commentary or remarks." This is a system which is crafted to require silence, leading to a lack of engagement and very timid activism among professionals. This silencing raises the question of what ethical system are we as design professionals bound by? Is it more like the medical profession's Hippocratic oath, do no harm, or that of the legal profession, provide the best representation for our clients irrespective of the merits? This is a very important question for the education of the next generation of professionals. Finally, telling our story. We have been blindsided by an aggressive campaign of disinformation and negative spin. We in the design professions and people who care about culture in the city were asleep at the switch. We didn't protest the long period of neglect and allowing these important structures to fall into disrepair. We didn't mount a preemptive campaign before their imminent destruction was obvious, and by then we were very much on the back foot. We did not anticipate how much this had become a polarizing issue politically, and have failed to effectively tell our story and take the fight to the public by advocating for keeping these buildings functional, keeping them intact, keeping them relevant and useful, rather than waiting until too late. The concept of temporal distance also plays a significant role. Mid-20th century architecture is still too close to us, and as a result, the public often overlooks its importance. It hasn't yet gained the historical distance needed for broader recognition. Only as we move away from the time of its creation do we begin to understand its cultural significance more clearly. We need to help the public recognize that now innovative qualities and contributions, those innovative qualities and contributions of mid-20th century modernism. An added challenge for modernist architecture, particularly mid-20th century modernism, is it sometimes lacks the ready appeal of earlier periods, at risk because it is misunderstood and lacks the perceived historical depth or romanticism of early styles. Modernist buildings with their clean lines and functional design can seem more utilitarian and less artistic to some, making them undervalued. The materials used in modernist buildings can also age poorly compared to traditional stone or brick, leading to a perception that they're less durable or worth preserving. We have to find a language to overcome these issues of perception. Exceptions prove the rule. The Guggenheim Museum in New York is a shining example of how modernist architecture can be recognized and preserved before it reaches a point of crisis. Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece has become not only a beloved cultural institution, but also a symbol of architectural innovation. Its unique design, spiraling, fluid, and groundbreaking at the time, was appreciated early on, which helped mobilize preservation efforts and public engagement. It has since become a protected landmark, highlighting how important early advocacy can be in securing a modernist building's place in history. Another example is the Sydney Opera House in Australia. Despite initial challenges and budget overruns, this structure, designed by Jorn Utzon, was recognized as a cultural treasure, and preservation efforts began long before it faced any serious threat. Now a UNESCO heritage site, it stands as an emblem of mid-20th century architecture and innovation. In Canada, we have Habitat 67 in Montreal by Moshe Safdie. Initially conceived as a vision for futuristic urban living, this innovative concrete structure has been carefully maintained and updated, with some units modified to meet modern needs. It's another powerful example of how mid-20th century architecture can evolve through adaptive reuse while preserving its core integrity and design philosophy. These examples of successful preservation demonstrate that strong advocacy, early recognition, and public engagement are key. In the case of the Guggenheim, Sydney Opera House, and Habitat 67, the iconic status of these buildings was acknowledged before they fell into disrepair, making them easier to preserve and integrate in the cultural fabric of their respective cities. But these are rare exceptions. Contrast these with the Ontario Science Centre and Ontario Place, and why, in particular, these two were so susceptible to abuse. First, as noted, both projects were born out of a specific cultural moment, the centennial year, when there was a push to celebrate innovation and national pride. As time passed, the immediate connection to that celebratory context faded from public consciousness, and with it, the public's appreciation of their cultural importance, making them vulnerable. We've seen many other tragic losses when such advocacy was weak. A dramatic example from an earlier period, New York's original Penn Station, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece demolished in 1963. Its destruction led to a public outcry and the eventual establishment of New York City's Landmarks Preservation Commission, but it was too late to save the building itself. Penn Station's loss serves as a cautionary tale about what can happen when we fail to recognize the cultural value of our architectural heritage in time. So what accounts for the difference between the successes and the failures, and what can be learned from this? It largely boils down to an awareness and advocacy. Successful preservation efforts often involve support from passionate individuals or groups who recognize the architectural and cultural value of modernist structures. When we tell stories of these buildings in the way that the public can understand and connect to, they become more than just physical structures. They become cultural touchstones. And preservation doesn't mean freezing a building in time. Some of the most significant successful examples are where these mid-20th century modern iconic buildings have not just been retained, but have been allowed to evolve and take on new uses and adaptive reuse, add new technological features which still respect their original value, bringing the architecture into a place where it continues to be relevant and useful. A lot of the systems in these buildings need to be upgraded, responding to changes in use. They were seen as as untouchable and precious to the point where nothing could be done, but were brought into a new future in a sensitive way. Conversely, when there's a lack of advocacy and when economic interests prioritize development over preservation, modernist buildings can be more easily portrayed as dispensable, leading to neglect or demolition, and we lose irreplaceable parts of our heritage. Focusing on the Science Center and the pods in Ontario Place and the landscape of Michael Huff, each has a powerful story to tell. And I think part of the problem is that people in the design professions are also failing to tell these stories effectively in terms that have broad public appeal. We often speak in terms that resonate within our professional circles, using coded jargon that the public can't easily penetrate when extolling their virtues, but doesn't always connect. It becomes insider baseball. To secure the future of these buildings, we need to shift the narrative and tell stories that make their significance relatable and compelling to everyone. What is it about them that makes them worthy of protection? How can we make them relevant to the younger generation or to the newly arrived immigrant population in Toronto, which did not know their heyday? We underestimate the importance of storytelling, of talking about these buildings, writing about them, showing them, illustrating them to the public, not just in architectural journals and publications, and not just to audiences who are in the professions, but to the public in a way that disseminates the ideas about their value and helps them to become like those exceptions I cited. Experience-based stories that would turn these buildings from abstract concepts into relatable and cherished parts of our shared heritage. These two indeed marked a turning point in Toronto's architecture. Ontario Place with its futuristic pods and Cinesphere, and the Ontario Science Centre with its integration into the natural ravine landscape of the Don Valley, pioneered visionary approaches. These designs didn't just follow trends, they set new standards for what public spaces could be, embracing modern technology and interactivity. They truly pushed the envelope in architectural innovation. The Ontario Science Centre and Ontario Place aren't just buildings, they represent moments of cultural and social ambition. These places were not only physical structures, but experiences that reflected Canada's optimism and forward thinking in the centennial years. Zeidler and Huff's Ontario Place wasn't just a collection of structures, it was an experience that represented the possibilities of the future, blending nature, art, and technology. Sharing this narrative can help the public appreciate Ontario Place as a groundbreaking achievement in creating inclusive and inspiring public spaces. The pods housed interactive exhibits and provided breathtaking views, making cutting-edge technology and cinema accessible to all. The surrounding landscape, a first collaboration of these two designers, Zeidler and Huff, complemented this vision by integrating natural elements, creating ecologically inspired parkland that invited exploration and relaxation. Ray Moriyama's Ontario Science Centre starts with its visionary inception as a space that would democratize science, inviting visitors of all ages to engage with interactive exhibits that fostered curiosity and learning. The center's design, nestled into the Don Valley, was groundbreaking. It took inspiration from the natural surroundings, creating a space that integrated with the landscape rather than imposing upon it. This approach mirrored the center's mission to explore the relationship between humanity, technology, and environment. Inside the open, flexible spaces allowed for evolving exhibits, ensuring that the widely imitated Science Center stayed current with scientific advancements. For decades, it served as a beacon of innovation, sparking wonder in millions of visitors. So what happens when we fail? What is lost when we lose these remarkable structures? The physical city is the embodiment of cultural memory, and it's a serial story as we experience artifacts from various periods in our city. We tell the story of our own history, of where we've been and where we're going. And if we eliminate a critical chapter from that story, namely mid-20th century modernism, we're really doing a great disservice to our culture. It's a kind of cultural lobotomy that deprives us of a key part of our journey. We're jumping from the limited history we do preserve, which is 19th century and early 20th century, into the 21st century. And we're missing a key part of that progression. Mid-20th century modernism represents a critical chapter in our city's story, capturing a time of immense change and optimism. Erasing it, not only it disrupts the continuum of the built environment, but also our collective memory and identity. By preserving these structures, we maintain a richer, more nuanced narrative for future generations. It is clear that waiting until modernist buildings are on the verge of demolition is a losing strategy. We need a preemptive approach, one that mobilizes the public, engages policymakers, and creates a framework for early advocacy. This involves not just protecting modernist buildings, but reimagining how they can continue to serve our city in the 21st century. Upgrading and adaptive reuse are keys to this strategy. We need to demonstrate that these modernist structures can be updated to meet contemporary needs without losing their essence. By skillfully integrating new technologies and uses, we can ensure that they remain relevant and useful while also preserving the cultural legacy that they represent. But beyond that, we must also make the case for why these buildings matter, not just to architects and historians, but to the broader public. Telling their stories in ways that resonate will help build that kind of grassroots support necessary to sustain preservation efforts over time. You will note that I have not stressed a major reliance on regulation or legislation as a means of heritage protection. While important, this government has shown no hesitation in exempting itself from any form of regulatory constraint by changing the laws through a series of draconian bills. Much more significant at this point is mobilizing the court of public opinion. Ultimately, the lessons learned from the neglect of Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre must guide us in shaping a more proactive, and sustainable future for our modernist heritage. By recognizing the cultural value of these buildings, fostering public engagement, and championing adaptive reuse, we can chart a course that not only preserves our architectural past, but also ensures that it continues to enrich our cities for future generations. So can this actually work? I want to conclude with a positive example, that of the Ontario Greenbelt around Toronto and the inspiration it might provide. Citizens and environmental and planning professionals who did speak up were able to force the province of Ontario to retreat on its plans to open the Greenbelt through development through a combination of public outcry, activism, media scrutiny, and legal challenges. From the moment the Ontario government, led by Premier Doug Ford, announced its plans to open up portions of the Greenbelt for housing development, there was widespread public opposition. The Greenbelt, created to protect farmland, forests, and wetlands around the Greater Toronto Area, is deeply cherished by Ontarians. Environmental groups, local communities, and concerned citizens rallied to protect these lands. The groundswell was picked up by the media, which played a critical role in exposing the details behind the government's decision to open up the Greenbelt. The combination of public opposition and media scrutiny led to a significant political pressure on the government. Opposition parties in the Ontario legislature took up the cause. Public opinion shifted against the government, as polls showed that a majority of Ontarians opposed the development of the Greenbelt. As the backlash grew, even members within Ford's Progressive Conservative Party became uncomfortable with the decision, fearing it would hurt their political standing in future elections. Faced with mounting public opposition, allegations of favoritism, and potential legal battles, Premier Ford eventually announced that the government would reverse its decision and keep the Greenbelt protected. He acknowledged the mistakes made in the process, and promised not to open the Greenbelt for development in the future. To be sure, it was not a one-and-done victory, and the government keeps trying, and the vigilance needs to continue. But I believe there are important lessons for the current vulnerabilities we are experiencing defending mid-20th century heritage. I hope that this symposium will be more than a requiem or a post-mortem, but actually serve as a call to action. I look forward to the deliberations in the following roundtable and in the presentations and discussions tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ken, for this heartfelt keynote. So we're going to be listening right now to a short 10-minute lecture by Associate Professor Bridget Shim, who was actually one of the founding members of the Bureau of Architecture and Urbanism back in 1987.
My name is Bridget Shim, and I'm a faculty member at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto, and I'm a principal of Shim Sutcliffe Architects. Thank you for your invitation to this timely symposium. Let's start at the Shell Oil Tower at Exhibition Place, which was completed in 1955. At the time, Toronto did not have any glass and steel towers. The tallest tower in the city was the Commerce Court, clad in limestone with gargoyles on top. The competition entry submitted by architecture professor George Robb envisioned a rectangular steel and glass tower with an elevator, 2 exit stairs, and a viewing platform. This was one of the first modern buildings that had an observation deck in Canada. And exhibition goers often said to their friends, "Meet me at the Shell Tower." The Shell Tower predated the Toronto Dominion Centre by Mies van der Rohe, the Commerce Court by I.M. Pei, and it was the first modern skyscraper in Toronto by almost a decade, and undoubtedly one of the most futuristic buildings in Toronto when it opened. When Shell decided not to renew its lease, the American watch company Bulova took over the sponsorship in 1973, replacing the analog watch with a digital display that also monitored the temperature. In the mid-1980s, the tower was over 30 years old and in need of urgent maintenance. The stair and elevator were deemed structurally unsafe and required about $500,000 to fix, according to CNE General Manager Winfield Stockwell. Does this sound familiar? The demolition of the Bulova Tower in the fall of 1985 was a decisive moment. Its footprint took up the space of two car spaces, and it was deemed to be obstructing a one-day Indy car race on the CNE grounds. Despite its prominence as a landmark, despite its status as a meeting place, the Bulova Tower lacked any legal protection. Exhibition Place manager at the time, Bill Stockwell, said, "We had about $150,000 in our budget to repair the Bulova Tower, so we decided to put our money instead into an older structure, the music building." The poster on the left is for a rally held at the tower with floodlights drawing attention to the building's potential demise. Jane Jacobs and many other urbanists signed our petitions. Architecture critic Adele Friedman blasted the Toronto Historical Board for lacking the guts and the foresight to save the tower. The Historical Board manager, Scott James, said, "The Bulova Tower was a loss I would regret. The board has overlooked recent buildings for one reason or another. What we want is to develop some criteria for assessing modern buildings. In our sensibility, we're up to Art Deco, and it is a slow process of turning the ship around." The reluctance of the man on the street to acknowledge the historical significance of the Bulova Tower and its unwanted removal from the CNE grounds inspired a group of concerned architects and urbanists to organize a series of public events aimed at raising awareness of Toronto's modern architecture. The Bureau of Architecture and Urbanism was formed not as a preservation agency, but as a voluntary unit advocating an active interest in contemporary architecture and architects. We began by researching Toronto's modern period. We interviewed many of the key architects who shaped Toronto's modern movement. BOW, as we were called, was inspired by J.M. Richards, an English-based architectural critic writing for the Architectural Review. In his seminal essay, The Heritage Mentality, Fearing Modern Architecture, he noted our growing efforts to look after old buildings are to be admired and supported, and their conservation should be a continuing preoccupation, and it should not be fueled by fear of what will take its place. If an old building has to go, if we do not have the confidence to look forward as well as back, future generations will find nothing that we have built worth making efforts in their turn to preserve. In a way, this was such an important statement about the issue of our past and our future at the same time. Our BOW research taught us that there were many modern movements that were both global and local, and that they could coexist. Toronto buildings could be part of the Modernist project while addressing many local conditions simultaneously. The image on the right is Kenneth Frampton's book, The Other Modern Movement, where he so eloquently articulated the position that a building can be modern while addressing local materials, local climate, and local culture at the same time. The Bureau of Architecture and Urbanism was Ruth Cocker, Mark Baroness, the late Detlef Mertens, George Capellas, and me. Our BOW group met regularly every week for a long time, discussing this important period of Toronto's history and fully understanding the optimism and exuberance that fueled its architecture. From the outset, BOW had 3 items on its agenda: 1, a catalog with 5 essays by 5 architects, 10 selected buildings, and a timeline providing a political, economic, and social context for the modern period. The second item was a public symposium held in the City Hall Council Chamber, and then a public exhibition also held in the City Hall Rotunda. Toronto Modern Architecture 1945 to 65, and you can see the beaten up cover that I have here, was published in 1987 by Coach House Press. It was a pioneering effort to identify and appreciate the impact of modernism on local Toronto built form. 10 buildings, and they are listed here on the right, were chosen to represent the tremendous architectural variety of this 20-year period following World War II. We feel they represented the spirit of their age, a vital mood of expansiveness, experimentation, and confidence on the part of Toronto architects and their clients. The 10 selected buildings were included in the Toronto Modern Catalog, and each building was documented using commissioned photography by the wonderful architectural photographer Stephen Evans. We also worked with architecture students who drew site plans for each of the 10 buildings with the urban context from the year each building was completed. In the lower right, you can see the site plan for Massey College with its urban context from the 1960s. Bao also retained Teet Talmud of Talmud Design as our graphic designer, and his modernist approach to design exuded the spirit of the modern period in Toronto. Toronto Modern's public symposium was held in the Toronto City Hall Council Chamber. The moderator of the symposium was the late Barbara Frum, who began the proceedings by stating that it is easier to love your grandparents than your parents. She implied that modern buildings, like our parents, were too close to us to be appreciated, while Toronto's Victorian buildings were more like our grandparents, who were much more lovable. The invited speakers at this symposium included the late Dr. Kurt Forrester, who was the head of the Getty Center in Los Angeles at the time, Donald Mackay, a professor at the University of Waterloo's Architecture School, and Colin Vaughan, architect, local councillor at the City of Toronto and advocate for modern architecture. The late George Baird and my colleague George Capellas were respondents. The council chamber of the City Hall is a truly public location for a symposium. The space is so bold, so modern, and yet so intimate. The entire council chamber was packed, and the discussion was lively and engaging. The image on the right was Teet Talman's program for the symposium itself. The third part of Toronto Modern's master plan was an exhibition to be held in the rotunda of Toronto City Hall. We set up construction scaffolding in the rotunda and even borrowed furniture from one of Irving Grossman's residential clients, which included a 14-foot-long sofa grouping that you can see in this image. Bao was using these tools, the exhibition, the symposium, the catalog, to uncover the qualities of the architectural decades 1945 to 65 that distinguished it from other architecturally historic periods, and to identify the characteristics that are worthy of attention, preservation, and our appreciation. So I'll just briefly go through the 10 buildings and give you an update as to what has happened to them. The earliest of the 10 buildings selected for Toronto Modern was the Mechanical Engineering Building at the University of Toronto, completed in 1948 by the firm Allward and Gwynlock. It was the first modern structure on the University of Toronto's campus that deviated from the traditional collegiate Gothic style. The limestone facade and strong stair tower with its industrial detailing signaled a new era for the campus. Traditional Toronto architectural firms who knew how to detail Georgian buildings really well by addressing our climatic zone, quickly shifted their detailing to express this new modern period. This building is really part of the St. George campus and remains intact except for the incremental air conditioning units, which have been added to its west facade. The next of our 10 buildings was the Don Mills Convenience Center, as it was called at the time, designed by John B. Parkin with landscaping by Macklin Hancock and Sasaki. It consisted of a small group of small shops connected by a covered pedestrian mall that felt very civic. This project demonstrates how delicate the balance is between architecture and landscape and its contribution to a vital public realm. During our many research interviews, we talked to Henry Fleece, an architect as well as a resident of Don Mills during the 50s. He recalled that on summer evenings, the shopping center was the place where he met many of his neighbors, and that with the landscaping in these spaces, there was very much a civic feeling. A few years after this photograph was taken, the outdoor shopping mall was enclosed, and subsequently all the gardens were removed. After that, the shopping mall was demolished, and Cadillac Fairview has reimagined Don Mills as a new urbanist community, still focused on retail. And the image on the right is a plan of the current Don Mills. One of the projects presented by J.M. Richards, the New Buildings of the Commonwealth, was a petite office building by James Murray, who was an architect and the editor of Canadian Architect. The Anglo-Canadian Insurance Company headquarters, which you can see on the left, was one of the first examples of a curtain wall building in Toronto with its bright green vitrolite panels. The building is a veritable textbook of modern planning, composition, and construction. It is also an early example of a mixed-use building combining corporate offices, a bar, and restaurant. This building has since been demolished and replaced by a stucco-clad chateau-style apartment building on the same site. Don Mills was a planned garden city. The integration of industry into the garden community where you lived and played was part of the initial concept for Don Mills. The plant and offices for Ortho Pharmaceuticals was designed by the office of John B. Parkin in 1955. The concrete structural frame of the office portion stands in front of the plant building, which is clad in white glazed brick infill panels. The articulation of these two structural systems and their skins distinguishes two different programmatic functions within the unified building mass. Ortho Pharmaceuticals was just one of many suburban headquarters located in Don Mills. The original Ortho Pharmaceutical buildings are still there and have undergone several massive renovations and expansions in 1961, 1966, and 1991. Another one of our buildings selected was the Benvenuto Apartment Hotel, as it was called at the time. And it set the standard for modern apartment design during the post-war period, and today remains a model of sophisticated urban housing in Toronto. The rental apartment hotel was designed by Page and Steele in 1955, and Peter Dickinson was the partner in charge. Hooper and Yawlis were the structural engineers for this project. The Benvenuto apartment is no longer a rental building. It has been converted into condominiums, and it became part of Toronto's inventory of heritage properties in 1989. The Fogel House is one of 3 commissioned residences designed by Toronto architect Irving Grossman within months of each other in the late 1950s. The Fogel House won a gold medal from the Massey Architectural Awards in 1961. This house represents a new phenomena of the private residence designed by architects outside of the urban core of the city. Several of Irving Grossman's residences, including the Fogel House, have been sold by their original owners, demolished, and replaced with McMansions on the same site. The O'Keeffe Center represented the state-of-the-art theater design for a multi-purpose performance space in 1960. Owned by the City of Toronto, the space was renamed the Hummingbird Center, then the Sony Center for the Performing Arts, and is now called Meridian Hall. In 2008, the theater was designated as a heritage building, and it also underwent major renovations, reopening again in 2010, 50 years from the date of its first opening night performance. The interior is lined with a 100-foot-long mural by R. York Wilson celebrating the arts. And you can see that in the lower left. In 2006, the performing arts venue received approval from the City of Toronto for the development of a high-rise condominium beside the center, and it was designed by Daniel Libeskind and located in the southwest corner of the property. And you can see that in the image on the right. Another one of our 10 buildings was Massey College in the University of Toronto, which was a gift from the Massey Foundation to the university in 1963. The building was designed by Ron Tom, who won an architectural competition organized by the Massey family to realize their aspiration for a new graduate residence at the University of Toronto. Massey College was the vision of Vincent Massey, the first Canadian-born Governor General, who wanted the college to possess certain qualities: dignity, grace, beauty, and warmth. My partner Howard Sutcliffe and I were the college architects of Massey College from 1995 to 2014. We renovated the St. Catherine's Chapel, you can see in the lower right, the Robertson Davies Library, the lower left. We created a new west gate, upper left, and improved accessibility and cooling of the college, upper right. Massey College is not in danger of demolition. In 1989, it was a building of architectural significance under the Ontario Heritage Act. In 2013, it received a landmark award from the Toronto Association of Architects and the Prix de Siècle Award from the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. Massey College is a beloved building which is well used by the University of Toronto. For the last decade, there has been no attention paid to the fabric of Massey College, its public spaces, its residential rooms, and after a decade of neglect, it is clearly in need of revitalization, and in a way, efforts need to happen to ensure that it remains a treasured building. The Toronto Dominion Centre was the first of the major Canadian banks to have built a modern headquarters complex in Toronto's financial core. The Toronto Dominion Centre is arguably one of Mies van der Rohe's best work. In this view of the banking pavilion with its book-matched green marble oak from the Forest of Nottingham, you see this kind of spectacular modern loggia, and one of the finest architectural spaces in the country. In 2012, as part of their ongoing commitment to sustainability, the TD Bank decided to go green, upgrading the aging roof of their flagship banking pavilion. The new vegetated living roof provides improved thermal resistance, reduces the urban heat island effect, and limits stormwater runoff. In addition, the design preserves the existing roof grid pattern, which is a protected element of the designated heritage aspect of this building. You could think of the green roof as the fifth elevation of the banking pavilion, visible from the office towers adjacent to it. This is an image from September 13th, 1965, when Toronto's new City Hall formally opened to much fanfare, anticipation, and excitement. The international competition for the new City Hall in 1958 was probably the most significant architectural event in the post-war period. Modernist luminaries such as Eero Saarinen, Ernesto Rogers, C.E. Pratt and Sir William Holford served on the jury, along with the University of Toronto professor Eric Arthur, who acted as the professional advisor. The jury selected Finnish architect Vio Ravel's futurist scheme for our City Hall and its public spaces. One of our Toronto Modern exhibitions, the one that took place in the rotunda of the City Hall, proudly displayed Vio Ravel's 1958 futuristic plexiglass model for the new City Hall, shipped from Finland to Toronto for the jury deliberation. It was truly lovely. The Toronto City Hall is more than a building. The Toronto City Hall transformed the image of our city, and with it, the public's perception of what modern architecture was. In 2006, the City of Toronto launched an international competition for the redesign of Nathan Phillips Square. The winning design by Plant Architect and Perkins and Wills enhanced Toronto's civic signature. Major architectural components, including the redesign of the skating pavilion and the creation of a permanent stage, were positive additions to the plaza. You can see that on the image on the right. And the City Hall of Toronto has one of the largest publicly accessible green roofs, a popular urban retreat for sitting and strolling. And you can see that from the image on the left. Also, many books have been written about the Toronto City Hall, adding to our understanding of this important modern building that defined modernism in Toronto. This in Civic Symbol, Christopher Armstrong, and you can see that the cover on the left, chronicles the complex and controversial development of this urban landmark. The image on the right is a cover of George Capellas's book, Competing Visions, tracing the 1958 competition, which was the largest architectural competition of its era. It attracted over 500 entries from architects around the world, even more than the Sydney Opera Hall competition. And George pays attention to the other entrants and subsequently the impact of the competition for the City Hall on global architectural culture. We moved to the year 2002, 15 years after Toronto Modern was published. The Association for Preservation Technology International, APTI, reprinted the Toronto Modern catalog for their annual conference. They made the cover black instead of red, and the introduction was made by Michael McClellan and Mark Fram, and then a reintroduction was made by Marco Polo, who was then editor of the Canadian Architect at the time. So you have a kind of revisiting 15 years after Toronto Modern was published in 1987. Since Toronto Modern, there have been many other books in different parts of the country reflecting on this important modern period. We have Winnipeg Modern Architecture, 1945 to 1975, and this includes critical and historical essays on the aesthetic and social project of modernism in Winnipeg. The next image is Robert Mellon's book, Newfoundland Modern, and it's the first comprehensive work of this important time period. And here it's 1949 to 1972, which really aligns with the time that Joey Smallwood was the Premier of Newfoundland and shows buildings that were cultural, commercial, recreational, and places of worship in the modern period. We're also all grateful to the work of Elsa Lam and Graham Livesey for their book, Canadian Modern Architecture, 1967 to the Present. Architectural historian Kenneth Frampton states that this anthology comprises the contributions of 17 scholars representing successive generations of Canadian intellectuals in the field, ranging from academics to critics and to architects, and in many instances, individuals who are all three. By any standard, this is an encyclopedic tour de force documenting 50 years of Canadian architectural production across the expanse of what is still a sparsely populated continent. At the other end, the Globe and Mail's architectural critic Alex Bozikovic worked to realize 305 lost buildings in Canada, reminding us of the architectural treasures that we have really lost battles over the years. And you can see on the cover a line drawing of the old Shell oil tower with its analog clock face. So in closing, Toronto modern architecture was one attempt to inspire civic action, and it offered a constructive path toward the preservation of buildings from 1945 to 1965. Clearly, we need to continue our efforts beyond this limited time period. The two significant buildings at risk, the Ontario Science Centre and Ontario Place, were 1970s buildings that deserve our attention, our respect, and our recognition. In the Bureau of Architecture and Urbanism's introductory essay in Toronto Modernism, we stated that there is a willingness in the architectural community to revive public interest in contemporary architecture. An initiative such as Toronto Modern is not, after all, the isolated gesture of a small group of individuals, but an enterprise with a broad base of support. While in 1987, this had more the ring of hope than it did of truth, by 2024, the balance has clearly shifted. And this symposium and our ongoing civic action is both timely and urgent. Thank you very much. My name is Bridget Shim, and I'm a faculty member at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape.
All right, so thank you so much for your attention. I would like to call to the stage for the round table our acting dean, Robert Levitt, who's going to be sharing it, Chris Clover, MPP of Spadina, Fort York, Javier Orsin from the World Monument Fund, Shirley Bloomberg, partner at KPMB, Alex Bozikovic from the Globe and Mail, and finally Richard Sommer, our previous dean and professor at the Daniels Faculty. Thank you so much for joining us.
I don't think I need this. Oh. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight and joining me on stage, and welcome everybody. I wanted to start the discussion with a few thoughts and questions, and then have everyone seated here perhaps make some introductory remarks about their thoughts on the questions of preservation and heritage and the challenges that we face in Toronto, and how they may relate to the particular buildings that have given rise to tonight's discussion. But I mean, the question that I've had on my mind in preparation for this evening's event is, why is it that, what are the circumstances in the way that we think about preservation and heritage in the city of Toronto that may be shaping broader perspectives on modernist heritage, or just how we understand what is worth preserving, what matters to us, how ideas about such things are shaped in the context of public opinion. I think part of that context is in the city of Toronto is one which has gone through and is continuing to go through massive change. And modernization, I mean, even though modernization brings great excitement and can be a source of optimism for many people, it's also a source of trauma. It is in a constant state of erasing what was and replacing it with what is coming into being, and also with what is unknown. I think it is in that context that we see some of the strategies that have taken shape in the way in which we undertake preservation, which seems to be divided into two almost polar regions. On the one hand, I mean, I think something which is more ubiquitous in Toronto than I've seen in any other city. We are preserving small buildings which are treated as baubles at the bottom of our much larger city making. You know, so we have facades and houses which are preserved at the bottom of towers. This strategy, in a sense, seems to suggest that there is something wrong with the way in which our contemporary city is growing up. It needs a kind of prothesis of historic material to produce an acceptable form for the way in which we are modern, the way in which the city is modernizing on the one hand, and at the other end of the extreme, we're preserving entire neighborhoods, basically super blocks of protected territory, which is forcing all of our contemporary density onto the avenues. But it does sort and separate the sources of our intensification from those neighborhoods which we prize as being reservoirs of familiar habitat. And it doesn't suggest ways that we can understand the relationship between the two. But I also think that it also forces us to experience, in many instances, the process of modernization as one which is both extreme and traumatic. And I think it colors the way in which we understand modernist, I'll call it modernist heritage, that buildings of modernist vintage are painted with a brush which is connected with the negative experience of modernization more generally. So this is my opening gambit and set of thoughts, but I would like to ask our panelists also to make some opening remarks before we begin to have a discussion about these challenges that we all face. Maybe I'll start at the opposite side with Richard, and then we'll come back around to me.
Okay, I did prepare some remarks. I just, in general, want to say that I don't have that much to add to what has been said very eloquently and more than once in different venues by many of our talented journalists, Alex Pazikovic, Sean McAuliffe, and others who have spoken. And I myself have occasionally done my small part by going on the radio and trying to fight the good fight for these buildings. So I want to talk a little bit more broadly about the subject of heritage and the problems it poses for us. But before I do want to emphasize two things that Ken said that relate a little bit to my comments. One, not so directly, to emphasize his point that a lot of what is going on, particularly in Ontario Place, has to do with privatization and with a different attitude towards who owns and who should control the public realm. So the whole question and the issue that Alex has traced is who pays, you know, what are the leases, who controls, these are critical things. And then the part that relates more to our work, our need to do better storytelling about what the value of these things are. So with that background, I would say I'm much more interested in calling these things monuments than places of heritage, and I'm going to explain why. The notion that monuments are the most explicit manifestation of cultural heritage has become, I would say, more urgent of late. And thus, whether we're talking about the theater where Malcolm X was assassinated or a statue of a Confederate soldier in the American South, monuments are important sites of scrutiny about whose lives and which histories we acknowledge and we celebrate. So, or conversely, we discard. So the question before us tonight about so-called modernist monuments held up for their seemingly aesthetic value may appear to bypass these problems, but I don't actually think that they do. These problems of for whom and by whom. So to have a meaningful debate around modern heritage, I think we need to unpack the very term heritage. The emergence of the term heritage to describe the selective preservation, reconstruction, and fabrication of artifacts from the past is, of course, itself historical. In her book titled The Invention of the Modern Monument, which I recommend to all of you who are interested in this subject, the scholar Francis Shui points out how the French concept of patrimony, meaning inherited property passed down by the law from fathers and mothers to children, corresponds most closely with the English term heritage, and how this elegant and very ancient word was originally tied, again, to the familiar economic and juridical structures of a stable society, a society highly rooted in space and time. But the concept of heritage has been modified today, and she's writing about 20 years ago, by a variety of adjectives, genetic, natural, historic, that have rendered heritage a kind of nomadic concept, one that travels across time and place and is the subject of a highly mediatized industry. As another important scholar in this area, David Lowenthal, has pointed out, our modern conceptions of heritage are no longer circumscribed by familial acts of inheritance and tradition, but rather are a part of our popular culture. Paradoxically, in North America, this more popular notion of heritage grew out of a material culture of what had been the domain of what was once called traditional heritage. House museums of notable people, period rooms highlighting original furnishings, and restoration villages that embody a kind of living history. And in some ways, the Jetsons-like atmosphere of Ontario Place was the village of the future to the kind of living history of Flintstones of the past. So now, if we think about heritage and we think about, on the other hand, the idea of history, in recent times, the study of history as opposed to heritage has become more hermeneutic and self-conscious about questioning received ideas and accepting established stories and narratives. So this ranges from Eric Holtzman's writings on the invention of tradition to the museum installations of Fred Wilson. So really, for me, here is the problem. In societies aspiring towards democracy, especially those like ours whose populations are ethnically diverse and are characterized by high rates of immigration, the notion of some sort of shared common heritage, even a popular one, becomes a conundrum. To whom was Ontario Place an important site in its heyday, and to whom is it an important site today? Whose memories and experiences are attached to Moriyama and Tashima's Science Center? Who are the stewards, and who gets to say these are important cultural assets, and why? So I'd like to argue that the oscillation between contention and consensus around which aspects of the past are shared and which should be preserved can be reformulated as really a distinction between history and heritage, and I come down on the side of history. So history making begins by opening the past to scrutiny and questions. Heritage, as David Lowenthal noted, makes the past familiar and consumable. So as members of a pluralistic society where what stands for shared heritage is always going to be the subject of democratic contention, I think we all need to be skeptical in the use and misuse of heritage. I think many of the people in this audience would agree that the case the Ford government made, that Ken pointed out so systematically, for discarding the Ontario Science Center and tearing up Ontario Place was quite thin. It was suspicious, it was specious, we can use lots of adjectives. In the case of the Science Center, it was, as Ken said, the typical blaming the victim strategy of letting the thing fall apart and then saying it was too obsolete to renew. Ontario Place, I think, is a more complicated situation. Ontario Place grew out of a very modernist, futurist vision, embodied in a highly ephemeral, yet monumental set of event spaces. Ontario Place was a temporary monument, of the kind envisioned by Siegfried Gideon and others who spoke of a new monumentality after the Second World War. But when the events ran their course and the temporary programming that animated Ontario Place, its very light infrastructure evaporated, its very thin architecture ceased to have a reason for being. The greatest legacy of Ontario Place is likely its infrastructure of landforms and mature trees, and to my mind, that is what should have been most respected, and tearing out those trees was the most terrible sin in my view. So while we don't trust that any project that the Ford government aligns itself with will replace anything it tears down with something better, I think we're talking about something that's even a broader problem than that. when these modernist projects were built, many believed the future would be better and brighter, and that architecture would help inaugurate that future. But who believes this today? How many people believe that architecture and urbanism can do this? So when we align ourselves today with, I would say, an ethos that is more about repairing, renewing, and reusing what we have, I think this brings us to the question at hand. And we need to ask ourselves how we could have better imagined and told better stories, and what a viable project of repair, renewal, and reuse might have been for these former sites of glory, and what it might have to do with our history.
Javier.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, and hello, everyone. I think I'm just going to very briefly say a few words about how World Monuments Fund got involved in Ontario Place, and a little bit of the work that we did, because I think I hope that will bring some light and points of discussion in terms of kind of the gaps that we try to fill through the initiative, The Future of Ontario Place. And basically, in 2019, World Monuments Fund, through our initiative, the World Monuments Watch, received a nomination from a group, the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, here in Toronto, nominating Ontario Place to our watch. The watch is a nomination-based program. We received hundreds of nominations of heritage sites from all over the world. It's a very competitive process. But we really want to, through the watch, really want to try to help sites and communities who care about those places in addressing challenges or implementing projects that might take advantage of opportunities that are happening at those sites. And Ontario Place was included in the watch of 2020, and that following the inclusion in the watch, I came to Toronto to conduct a site visit. And while I knew a lot through the nomination and the photographs that were submitted to us about the architecture and a little bit about the history of Ontario Place, when I was here, I have to admit that I was so impressed by really the movement of people that were behind the advocacy efforts to preserve Ontario Place, even with all the, let's say, governmental and political challenges that they were encountering. And then I realized that Ontario Place wasn't only about the buildings, the architecture, but it was also about the landscape, and it was also about the public space, and it was also the fact that the Ontario Place provides access to public quality space in the waterfront of Toronto, which it's a great thing, as we also discovered through our project during the pandemic. And after that site visit, we started working together, World Monuments Fund, in partnership with the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario and the Daniels Faculty of the University of Toronto, with Aziza Chaouni working from the university side. And we try to address a few issues. One was kind of a generational gap that we encountered, that while a lot of people of certain generation knew and had a lot of memories about Ontario Place, younger generations didn't really know much about it, and in some cases they had never even visited. So really to put the spotlight and to raise more awareness about Ontario Place as a public space, the buildings that really compose the entire site, and really the importance of, again, the access to the waterfront. We also realized that there was obviously the threat of demolition from the provincial government, and that there was really a need to support the local advocacy efforts against the potential demolition and disappearance of Ontario Place. And also we realized that, the way World Monuments Fund work is always through promoting and fostering participatory process in any type of project we do, and we realized that there was a need to do that, and a need to produce kind of a foundation of knowledge that could serve to not only advocate for the preservation of the site, but also to find solutions about potential adaptive reuse ideas, to understand the changes over time, the historical, social, and architectural significance. So to that end, we articulated our initiative, The Future of Ontario Place. And well, the photographs that we are seeing here is actually a collection of modern sites where World Monuments Fund has been working in recent years. And maybe I can say something about that later, because all of them are really interconnected in terms of the issues and challenges that they face. Public apathy, lack of protection, lack of expertise, and also need for awareness. So through Ontario Place, I'll try to be very brief, but for Ontario Place, what we really did through the Future of Ontario Place was to really capture all the changes that the site went through over time, the sites that disappeared, new places that appeared at Ontario Place. We also did a very thorough kind of analysis of every building, the uses, the architecture, the circulation spaces. We also brought the kind of social dimension and human dimension of why these places are important for people, which is, again, as I was saying before, very important for us to really foster public awareness, public participation, and interviewed a lot of people, architects who had a lot of knowledge about Ebb Seiler and Michael Hoff's work. We also interviewed people who go to Ontario Place to run, to play basketball, to do parkour, to really understand why this place is so important for them. How do they use it? And then we also interviewed a lot of people that were using Ontario Place to have access to public space during the pandemic in 2020, 2021, when we had all so many limitations about, kind of keeping distance between each other and, really the value of Ontario Place as a public space. We also put together a design/preservation challenge, and encouraged all the schools of architecture in Canada to submit proposals to preserve Ontario Place, bringing also change and adaptive reuse ideas. Because we also, the way we see preservation at World Monuments Fund is not as a field to keep change away from places, but rather to manage change and bring a new life to places. And we also did a lot of public programs and other events that really brought together a lot of people around Ontario Place from different perspectives. This is very important because for us, this is really the foundation of any decision-making process that need to happen at Ontario Place. Unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of changes that are happening now without that level of thorough analysis and participation. But we really, with our work, we try to contribute to kind of bring a lot of ideas and knowledge to really foster a participatory process for the preservation of the site. So, I just wanted to share that with everyone because I really didn't know if everyone was aware of the work we did, and we hope that that work will be used in the future for any decisions.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for that work. Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Glover. I'm the Member of Provincial Parliament for Spadina-Fort York. I'm a little bit hoarse today. It's actually a real honor to be up here on this panel, and especially to be sharing a stage with Ken Greenberg, who is, and I say this with the greatest respect, an elder. Okay, but also a combatant in many, many fights to preserve our architecture in this city. And I want to leave you, I'm not an architect, but I'm coming at this from a political perspective. And I want to talk about how we, you talked about a call to action. I think, we need to be stronger than that. We need a call to arms because the threat to our architectural heritage, our very society in this province is grave. And I want to leave you with one phrase and one term. The phrase I want to leave you with, a friend of mine is a older businessman, spent his whole life going around the world looking for businesses that he would buy up or partner with. and they would turn them into profitable businesses. And he said his whole career was dedicated to mining for profit. And I think he was actually a good person, an honorable person. But that same ideology of mining for profit is what is driving our politics today. And they look at, the wealthiest in this country are looking at our public sphere and our public assets like Ontario Place and the Science Centre as places to make profit. The Science Centre is going to be turned into a bunch of condominiums, and it's going to be owned by one of the developers that sat at the Premier's wedding. And the Ontario Place, it's been sold off. It's not even been sold off. It's been given away for 95 years to an Austrian spa company and to Live Nation, an American corporation. And this it's an attack on, it's an economic attack. It's the Premier's admitted, it's $1.5 billion taxpayer donation to that project. It's an attack on our environment. They waived the Environmental Assessment Act protections, so they didn't do an environmental assessment. And so when they cut down all those trees, one of the things that happened, the coyotes ended up leaving, and if you read the news today, or in the last couple of days, coyotes are now in Liberty Village, and they're becoming very aggressive because their habitat, their dens have been destroyed, because there was no environmental assessment done. It's an attack on our democratic rights. Bill 154, the Ontario Place Act, stripped us of the right, or attempts to strip us of the right, to take the government to court for, and as Ken mentioned, for acts of misfeasance, which means abuse of government power. So they're trying to strip us of our democratic rights, and it's also stripping us of our cultural heritage. And I want to talk a little bit about that because Ontario Place was designed at a time when nobody described themselves as an Ontarian, and we still don't. We all describe ourselves as Canadians, but it was designed to celebrate this province. And, Ken mentioned Eb Zeidler, the architect, and Michael Huff, the landscape architect. But there was also Eric McMillan, who designed Children's Village and was the inventor of the ball pit. And okay, it may seem like a small thing, but millions of kids have enjoyed ball pits all over the world because of Eric McMillan. And it was also a celebration of Graham Ferguson's IMAX cinema, which was an Ontario-designed technology. And so it was designed to celebrate Ontario and our heritage and to pass that on to future generations. Now we should be renaming it the Austro-American, place, because we need a new Ontario Place that actually will celebrate. So the word, and Ken mentioned this, the word I want to leave you with, so this mining for profit, it doesn't end with Ontario Place and the Science Centre, because the government passed a piece of legislation called the Real Estate Management Act, and it gave the minister direct power over the Ontario Science Centre, Ontario Place, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and the McMichael Gallery. And so the next targets may be the AGO and the McMichael Gallery. And if we don't, as Ken was saying, we've got to get ahead of this game. We've got to call this out because those are the next targets for privatization. And the very fact that the bill is called the Real Estate Management Act shows that there's no respect whatsoever for the public sphere, for our public assets, for our culture, our heritage. And I would say one other thing about this. With the word I want to leave you with is inspiration, because we have fought fights like this before, and Ken mentioned the fight for the St. Lawrence Market, for the Union Station, for the old City Hall. We won those fights. We won the fight against the Spadina Expressway. We can win these fights as well, but we need to mobilize, and we need to mobilize beyond the architectural community, because what is happening is we are in an ideological period of neoliberalism or neoconservatism or whatever you want to describe it as. It means money is king and money is power, and it's the power to accumulate more wealth and power, and they're looking at our public sphere and they're saying, there's where I'm going to be mining for profit. And we've got to change that, and we need to coordinate with all of the people who are suffering because of that ideology. Because almost everybody in this province, or the majority of people in this province, can no longer afford housing. They can no longer afford food. We've got 234,000 people homeless in this province, 1,400 encampments. And so we need to work with them as well, because they're not going to be concerned. If you're worried about getting food on the table for your family, you're not going to be worried about preserving a heritage building. And I would suggest that the architects have a role to play in building a bigger movement. And I think it starts with those 234,000 people who are homeless, because we need to design really cheap, really fast-built homes that provide basic shelter to people who don't have shelter in this province. And I think if the architects of this province actually got involved in that project and used all your connections to help solve that, then those people who get homes, they will help us to protect our heritage and our culture. So it's inspiration. So the two terms, mining for profit and then inspiration, because we need to inspire another generation, you know, with hope that we can work together, we can fight against these forces that are destroying not just our architectural heritage, but our society. And so, you know, thank you for Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Chris Glover. I'm the Member of Provincial Parliament for Spadina Fort York.
Glover.
Chris Glover, Glover. Okay, I have business cards. I can give it to you at the end of the day. NDP. Yes, of course. It's the good guys.
Ken. Thank you, Chris. I'll give it to Ken now.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing.
Wait. Oh, you're mic'd?
I've got to.
Oh,
can
okay.
you hear me?
Yeah.
I think what I was trying to say, and I'm going to say it much more bluntly now, I think what happened to Ontario Place, and I mean the totality of Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre, is actually roadkill in a much bigger struggle. It really, at the end, wasn't about architecture.
Right.
It decidedly was not about architecture. It was about a move to a very different kind of society, a profound clash of values. And I tried to stress the terrible chill factor which has been imposed on people in the design professions to the point where and it's not only it's more than the architects and the landscape architects, it's the engineers, it's all of the professionals have been very effectively silenced with threats and intimidation. And I'm reminded of when I was a student in this faculty centuries ago. And that was a moment in the history of Toronto when those three buildings, which it wasn't so much about the buildings, it was about public institutions and the importance of public life. Right. And when people, and the design architects and landscape architects in the day played absolutely leading roles, were extremely vocal, in fact ended up being part of the movement that took over City Hall and changed the direction of the city, and they took risks. They ended up not getting certain commissions because of speaking out so frankly about things. They were seen as leaders. Some of them actually went into politics and became councillors. Colin Vaughan, whose name was mentioned before, was a great example. And I think what I was hoping to achieve in my talk, if nothing else, was to make the audience of people who are in the design world recognize that it doesn't help if we just keep talking to ourselves about things that are seen as exotic and abstruse and not of relevance to the broader public. And where the connection, Chris, between the homeless encampments and people needing housing and the viability of our public institutions comes into play is they are an important part of public life. People need, the same people who need housing need public spaces, and they need to be able to go to the waterfront and not have to access it through a paywall. And I think that's the connection. And I really wish that we would wake up. We would wake up to a very real and present danger in a move to a very different kind of society. And why I kept stressing the values, going back to Expo 67, I may be one of the only people in this room who actually experienced it, but
I don't think
Few.
it was incredible. It was a feeling about Canada and Canadian possibilities and Canadian talent and giving all kinds of younger design professionals an opportunity to do remarkable things and taking risks and making a statement about the kind of society we want it to be. And I think somehow we have to recapture that, and it has to start by understanding that this whole issue is not insider baseball. It's profoundly political, and it has very, very broad implications.
Thank you, Ken. Alex.
Well said, Ken. And I don't want to disagree with Chris's analysis or with yours, Ken, and about the sort of attack on the res publica. But I guess I would just complement that by saying that also we need to think at the other scale. We need to think in practical terms and in specific physical terms. In other words, in design terms. The period that Ken mentioned in his talk of the late 60s through the early 1970s, the reform period in Toronto, produced a lot of things. It was the birth of the heritage movement, but it was also the birth of these sites that we're talking about today. And the same people such as Ken, were involved in both of those things. Eric Arthur, who organized the City Hall competition, was also a leader in heritage preservation, in documenting and understanding the architectural history of this place. So it was architects who were at the front of these linked conversations about seeing what was valuable in the existing city and articulating a new vision of the future, right? And I think that it is hard to imagine that today if you're immersed in Toronto politics, because the sort of what we have left from that period, unfortunately, is a slightly reactionary tendency, which is embodied, I think, by the way that heritage is being used now. The birth of heritage in the early 1970s was coming as a reaction to this incredible rebuilding of the city, which was at a much bigger scale than anything we're seeing now, where apartment buildings for 1 million people were constructed in a 20-year period. And so there was a real need, in some people believed, to reset and to take a breath and to see what was being lost and what was being destroyed. And I think that tendency of being sort of aggressively conservative about the built form of the city, I think is something that's stuck with us. And that manifests itself through heritage policy, and it also manifests itself through planning. The fact that the very many tens of thousands of houses across the city that are of no special kind of architectural value are left untouched. And that in turn makes some of the most important public places on the main streets and on large sites, things like schools, become more vulnerable as a result. So I guess what I would say is that we need to articulate, and designers need to be at the front of this, articulating a new positive vision for public space. And that needs to be clear, and it needs to be something that people can actually get their heads around. And I think we have been missing that here in government, both at the provincial level and at the city level. There's been a sort of an absence of vision. I can't think of a single architect or landscape architect who has had any major political influence in Toronto in the last 20 years. Since, Jack Diamond's influence faded, let's say. There has been, I think this is a problem, and I'll try not to go on too long here, but in the absence of such advocacy and in the absence of such vision, this is where this, idiot Therma proposal was able to sort of fill a void. The provincial government did not have a clear vision for that site. And even to look at Bridget's talking about Exhibition Place, there was a newspaper article from 1985 that mentioned that the site of Exhibition Place was being rethought by a task force. Well, what came of that, right? I mean, the city itself has shown no capacity to think proactively about what its public spaces could be, how those could change in meaningful ways that appeal to people. I mean, the only sort of visionary thing that we've seen come out of Toronto City Hall with respect to public space in the last decade was Rail Deck Park, which was, a thing that was never going to happen. So I think out of this this is a complaint, but it's also a statement of possibility, because this is a big city that still mostly believes in public goods and has quite a lot of money and quite a lot of people devoted to creating them and to keeping them up. So if we can just help organize around a vision in which design is prominent, in which specific ideas for specific places are prominent, and in which we can rethink the historic fabric of the city in ways that are creative, as happened 50 years ago, then maybe we get somewhere good. But I don't think we only get it by thinking in broad political terms. I don't think we only get it by making plans. I think we need specific proposals and a forward-looking, proactive approach to the evolution of the city.
Thank you, Alex. Shirley.
Thank you. Oh.
Here. There you go.
I'm feeling the heat of being a practicing architect on the stage here. Like Ken, I'm an immigrant. And I've never told you this, Ken, but Expo 67 was one of the reasons I came to this country. So there. And even in the southern tip of Africa, it had percolated down that this was a country of a great optimism and a country that thought it had a bright future. So the architecture we're talking about came in the wake of World War II, and Canada underwent a tremendous transformation in the 50s and 60s, social, cultural, and economic. And as I alluded to, there was an incredible national optimism across the country. And cities across the country embraced international modernism. It was a very aspirational architectural movement. It was about social change and embracing new construction technologies. I know because I was a student in the early 70s, and it was almost a giddy time in architecture. However, I think things always change, and in latter years, modern architectural practice became more banal, perhaps too much embraced by developers and clients. Architecture and real estate buildings became increasingly commodified. And there is, for this period of modern architecture, an uneven legacy in the city. We have wonderful buildings, and we have a whole pile of dreadful buildings.
The best second-rate architecture in the world, as George said about Toronto.
Right. And as Barbara Frum said, those grandparents are so easy to love. And, all those wonderful Victorian warehouses that are unbelievably robust, you can convert into anything you want, they have survived. So no wonder people default to valuing pre-modern architecture. Plus, our strength is our weakness. We're incredibly diverse, as Ken had mentioned, but that means a whole bunch of different cultural values, which makes it exhilarating but also frustrating in this regard. And we're also, unlike European countries, we are not sophisticated in terms of our design culture. So I do believe that there's always hope, and that it is our role. I think I very, very much believe that as architects, we're citizens first. And I did help stop a really dreadful monument in Ottawa a few years ago. Right. That would have been a disaster. Thank you very much.
Full credit.
And I'm known to sometimes collude with Ken. But seriously, I think it is, particularly given how dreadful the next 4 years are going to be, we should become even more resolute in doing what we think is the right thing to do and the force of public good and what's best for our society. This country had a very robust social contract when I came here, and I'd love to see that reawoken.
And Ken, you've spoken about this, right? The link that public space is both the result of a society that has robust sort of bonds between people and also helps to bring it about, right? The public space is where the space of appearance, the space of encounter.
Yeah, I mean, trying to weave all of the different comments together, I mean, it does strike me, and one of the things I was thinking about is that when we think of preservation or heritage, it's often defended in aesthetic terms, and particularly when it gets oriented towards individual buildings, which has become one of the, particular ways in which we see it in Toronto all the time. I know that we're discussing the Science Centre in Ontario Place, but I think a lot of the commentary has been about how to argue on behalf of civic space and public life. And these are the things that will galvanize, I mean, at some point governments must entertain the interests of their electorate, especially when they're organized. But what is it that galvanizes electorates? And I think it's where they see their interest. So there have been a lot of comments about how that comes about. One is, I think, Javier, you're describing in a way, an effort at raising consciousness about the value that people already have there, but it hasn't been articulated in like the way that people use it. Ontario Place and the site around it, for instance. But it's also interesting, Ken, you ended with a slide where you showed the green belt. And I think, landscapes are, the tremendous landscapes, which are the public realm of the city, including all of the, the ravines, that these are easy artifacts. People don't think of them as artifacts. They think of them as their place. And so I think that sometimes, the discourse, at least the discourse around heritage focuses too much. We try to persuade from the perspectives of elite appreciation of architectural works their merit, when in fact, and I think a lot of people have said this in different ways, that really their importance lies in their ability to construct a public domain that is shared by all of us. And the Science Centre has in fact been one for many communities, but I just think that's the way we have to orient our conversation. And Alex, I know that you're also bringing up that we have to have particular projects, but even the way you talked about it, it seems like the undergirding theme that those particular projects have is in their ability to constitute a civic realm.
Yeah, people can't get excited about a plan, and people can't get excited about a vague idea. They need a vision, right? This is why, I actually took it upon myself and my job to advocate for a different vision for the island airport, since that discussion seems to be coming back around. And I had to commission the brilliant landscape architects, Public Work, to imagine what this would look like if it turned into a park. Because while some advocates had done that in a lesser form a while ago, the city didn't do that. The city of Toronto just finished a master plan for the Toronto Islands, which very carefully did not touch the airport.
Right.
And so if I'm cobbling together, an alternative vision, why is that? Why is city government not doing that? Why is the profession not doing that? Where are the designers in imagining, even if it's not that particular site, in thinking about positive visions for public space in the city that we could have that require political organizing, right? And I think just architects don't see themselves in that way, but that used to be the norm. In the 70s, the Toronto Society of Architects was a very politically active, very vocal presence in local politics. And today, that same group is headed by Joe Leon, who will be here tomorrow, who is trying to revive that tradition. But it is, it's been missing, and I think we miss it. We lack it.
Right. Ken.
Yeah, I just want to try and tie a couple of things together. I was really struck when Bridget showed her slides by that gorgeous photograph in 1965 of Nathan Phillips Square.
Yeah.
And people were up on the walkways.
Yes.
And they were up on the roof. And there was an idea about public space, which was basically turn the streets over to cars and have pedestrians on a skyway level with a series of bridges. That was a terrible idea. And so I'm raising that because it's not about slavishly freezing something in a form that it was at a certain period of time, but allowing it to evolve as a serial creation where each generation gets to learn things, to make changes, to adapt. And we have never allowed Nathan Phillips Square to move into the 21st century. There have been all these half-hearted efforts, and it is actually deteriorating in the same way that we allowed the Science Center to deteriorate and Ontario Place to deteriorate. And it's lacking the kind of vision that Alex was talking about of how do you take that artifact and transform it into something that would be relevant to the way we use public space today. And I just cite that as an example. And I think that can be the failure of a fetishizing of heritage and freezing it, as opposed to thinking of it in evolutionary terms.
Well, just if I can very briefly, there was that competition 15 years ago, but that idea, the ideas were never fully implemented. So now there's been some new talk about exactly what you said about making this public square work better, but I don't think people realize that there's a vision that just they didn't do. They didn't execute it, right? So that's the degree to which these kind of public design projects have been, forgotten and, under-resourced and overlooked, right? We did this work already and then we just failed to deliver it.
It's also an irony that really, the thinking of a lot of modernist architecture was that it fosters events, and those events change, and even Ontario Place was conceived in such a way. And you look at the illustrations of many of the rethinking of monuments from the 20s and 30s and 40s, they are conceived of places that are susceptible to change. They were not meant to be frozen in time. And in fact, Richard and I were talking a little bit about that, and I think you have something you want to say about it. Richard, maybe?
Well, I try to say it during my talk, which is that Ontario Place wasn't conceived to endure. I don't think it was conceived to endure in time so much. It was really it was in the spirit of, World's fairs and festivals, and like Expo 67, there's not much of it left there. So I think it is a different case. And despite the fact that I agree that Nathan Phillips Square needs some attention, it does still function, okay? When there's a political protest, when the Raptors win, that place does buzz. And the problem of Nathan Phillips Square is a larger urban question because it's very much linked to an idea of the path and of all these parking spaces that exist that are invisible. So if you want to enliven it in the times when there isn't a Raptors win, you have to think about the larger urban infrastructure that surrounds it. But it's the kind of vision that I think you're asking for, Alex. That's still alive, I would say, though. Nathan Phillips is alive, is in the game.
Chris?
Well, and that would be, sorry, just very quickly, pedestrianizing streets. The answer there seems so clear to me. There's this vision for University Park that I had been trying to advocate for, but around Toronto City Hall, there's so much of the streetscape has been closed for construction of the Ontario line. That route, that should just never open again. Certainly not to cars, right? There's a sort of natural pedestrian zone that would liven the public realm.
The Sienna was the inspiration for Nathan Phillips Square, right? So it was a very funny, let's say, transposition.
It doesn't exactly look like Renaissance Italy, but yeah, I think, and Ken, you've talked about this a lot, if we could just be a little bit more creative about marginalizing cars in public space and taking back just a little of the road space that exists, there are huge victories to be won for very little money, politically difficult, but, otherwise really doable, that I think would really inspire people.
I think.
Sorry. Oh, is that on?
Yeah.
Yes. Everything's about context. And as we've often spoken, Ken, Toronto would be an incredibly progressive city if not for amalgamation. And our context is domination by suburban communities, right? We're in the minority. And that's a massive problem.
Chris.
I want to agree with what Alex said about proposals. I think proposals are really important because when there's a crisis, there's going to be change. And the change that happens depends on the ideas that are lying around. Yes. And yeah, actually, I'm quoting Milton Friedman there, which if you know who Milton Friedman is, may seem very odd, but you have to understand your enemy if you're going to actually be successful. And so the idea of proposals is really important. I think an analysis of where we're at to and why we're at where we are, we've got to talk about economics. You know, politics is all about economics. People get voted in, governments get voted in or booted out because they've actually, you know, improved people's life or not. And so in the 60s, the time that we're talking about, the post-war period there, it was the middle class was booming. You know, the tax rates on the highest income and the corporations was actually quite high. And that was the money that fueled the growth of the middle class, and it fueled, you know, the ability of governments to, you know, dream up the Science Centre and Ontario Place and City Hall and all these beautiful architectural gems that became, you know, the magnets and the places where we actually developed our culture here in the city of Toronto and in the province. And what's happened since then, we've got this neoliberal, the neoconservative, whatever you want to call it, but in the last 40 years, our GDP per capita has gone up by 50%, but our median income is flatlined. So most people are worse off today than they would have been, just in terms of income, they're worse off today than their parents were 40 years ago. And it's not a shortage of wealth, it's that all of the wealth has gone up to the very top 1%. And people are buying into it because the narrative that's created around it is really strong. They're going to cut taxes, and if they cut your taxes, you think, oh, I'm going to be better off. But what they do is they cut, you know, the billionaires' taxes, and they're a lot better off. But we, and actually, I don't know if they really are, because when you get a certain amount of money, like, I mean, are you really that much better off? But if we don't talk about the economics, you know, then, and we don't seize back the narrative around economics, around the fact that we are still a wealthy country, and that it is a political choice that there are 234,000 people homeless. You know, it's a political are buying up real estate across this province. And they're buying up our public real estate, they're buying up private homes, and then renting them back to us and making it a profit off of it. And so if we don't challenge this economic time, then we won't get the money back that we need to actually rebuild the public sphere. And, you know, the Ontario Place is a symbol of you talked about, you know, coming to Ontario because of, or coming to Canada because of Expo 67. You know, I looked at the Sydney Opera House, and I thought, I want to go to Sydney because I want to see the Opera House. I have no, you know, I don't even know what's in Sydney. I've never been there, but I want to see that Opera House, you know? Is it?
Hey,
I'll stop and I'll see the toy.
I think we have, so we do have some questions from the audience. I have them through an app. That's why I was looking at my phone, just by the way. I wasn't.
We're checking your email?
Not only. So I'm going to, we've used up a lot of time. I think it was great to hear from everybody, but I will I'll try to make a couple selections. One audience member asks, they're all anonymous, how can municipal politicians prevent NIMBY activists from using heritage preservation to block housing construction? Anybody want to take that?
I feel like that one's geared for me, but
I think the government has successfully eliminated that. My experience is that this legislation has actually made it very difficult for neighborhoods to do that. Maybe Alex, you can speak more specifically to the preservation of the smaller residential districts, but the process by which communities used to block housing has actually been broken down by the Ford government. You need very expensive lawyers to do it.
Well, look, I mean, that may be true in particular cases, but I think the big question is I guess the one point I would like to leave people with is in talking about any of these things about built form, there are specific local conditions at work, and that you can't talk about one aspect of built form or policy without talking about the others, right? Why are so many particular, Main Street heritage buildings in Toronto threatened? Because that's the only place in the neighborhood that development is allowed to go, and so on. And so I guess, we're in a weird place now where I think a lot of rapid policy changes happen in the last 20 years, and perhaps we haven't fully come to understand what it is and how it's going to work. And I think Toronto needs a new official plan, because its official plan from 20 years ago is now 20 years old and was very incremental even at the time. So I think there's a new vision for the city that is welcome. And I think the province may be helpful in creating that. But I think we need to perhaps, I'm perhaps wrong in assuming this, but I think a lot of people who are involved in heritage don't want to see a lot of change in the city. And I think in some ways and in some places we need a lot more change than is currently allowed. And so protecting what is important without being sort of reflexively opposed to all change, that's where we need to get. And we don't have that position today, but I think that's where we need to arrive at.
Can I respond as well? I think breaking down NIMBYism is really important. I live in Spadina, Fort York, so it's the downtown waterfront, and there's a lot of YIMBYism. Yes, we want development, but we want development that's smart, that builds complete communities, where there's parks and schools and daycares and, community centers. What the Ford government has done is just given the developers the right to bulldoze over, yes, and like somebody mentioned the rail deck. What's happened with the rail deck is the airspace has been privatized. And just this week we had a presentation. There's 9 towers going up there with 7,000 units, 12,000 people. And it's in between the well, which was just completed, it's going to put it in the shadow, and City Place. I love Spadina, Fort York. I think it's the greatest place to live, but not everybody in the country can live in Spadina, Fort York, And what they've done is the city appealed this, it's just completely out of scale for that neighborhood, and it's going to overcrowd an already one of the most densely populated communities in the city.
So I just want to add one thing. I was told 14,000, you said 12,000, but the stunning fact about that number of people is there are no schools planned. Yeah. And already in City Place, parents are having to have their kids bused somewhere else because the 2 schools that were built have long been oversubscribed. There's no community center. There's a few small daycares, but there's no social infrastructure. Mm-hmm.
And as Alex says, forcing the accommodation of housing, forcing the accommodation of housing into this particular form of towers is not the ideal form for every kind of family and demographic. We need more density, but we need it in different formats than condominium towers.
Well, and in different places. I mean, I've written about my own neighborhood. I live just west of the Annex, and that neighborhood had 9,000 odd people in 1972, and it has 5,400 and shrinking now. It's down by 40%, and that's in the entire western side of downtown Toronto, going north in a band up to St. Clair, has lost people. And that, a lot of those neighborhoods, and many of them in Toronto, have lost population and have public schools that are below capacity. So we have this weird standoff where the City of Toronto has been asked to take density and intensification and has chosen to put it all in 3% of the city. And then there's this crisis of a lack of social infrastructure while other very comfortable, well-served neighborhoods are hollowing out. And it's dumb. And that standoff is not well understood, but I think we need to look at the big picture and wonder if the whole pattern of how we're doing things needs to be rethought.
That's been a big picture and a large-scale plan that would be very contentious, right? There have to be competing visions that might actually lead to a progressive plan that would be adopted by the city, but I have no faith that the city could do that. And a lot of the greatest plans in history were not done by governments. They were done by citizen groups that then forced governments to adopt them. So we have to get at it.
I would say one other thing, too, about this. One of the other things the Ford government got wrong You know, and you're right about Seton Village, I'm assuming it is, you know, with the population decline. If you look at the demographics from 2016 to 2021, the majority of wards in the city of Toronto had declining population. All the density is along the waterfront and along Yonge Street, you know. So one of the things the Ford government did, though, is they're not allowing fourplexes as of right. And so you can't go into a community where there's declining population and, you know, single, like bungalows or whatever, and build fourplexes. And we need that kind of gentle density in mid-rise, and it's just not being allowed. So,
well, but the city did that, right? The city of Toronto has allowed that to happen now. The city itself, they weren't forced to, but they allowed it to happen. And look, this is getting kind of technical and weedy, right? But it also is, you know, fundamentally, we just need kind of a reset here to say, I think, you know, we believe in, you know, everyone here is excited about particular places that have, you know, particular cultural value, and maybe that needs to be questioned to a certain point. But, you know, nobody needs to, you know, there's no economic or social reason why, you know, the 100 most important cultural, you know, sites in the city need to be torn down, or even, you know, the 1,000 most important buildings in the city need to be torn down. It's a big city. Most of it is not that dense. A lot of it is losing population, and the socioeconomic conditions that we have are just, you know, forcing these tensions between, in many cases, between history, between heritage and new development that wouldn't be necessary if we could accept a different kind of compromise and a different form of development. Spread it out.
It's a false choice.
So
it's a false choice.
I just want to throw in what is a, you know, it's a, oh.
I want to throw in a quote from Jane Jacobs, which I think captures some of what we're saying. If you don't allow incremental change and promote incremental change, you get cataclysmic change, which can be highly undesirable. And I think that's what we're seeing.
I think actually, you know, I was talking with Sandy Smith from our forestry program about the difference between the word preservation and conservation as it related to forests. And I think, you know, preservation is trying to keep the forest intact as it is. And this is a bit what preservation, I mean, now preservation takes a wrong turn when this is the goal that we set for ourselves. And conservation, to my mind, would capture what you're describing, which is the incremental change, which is the kind of change that Jane Jacobs, I think, advocated. When she was concerned about protecting neighborhoods, you know, particularly after devastations of entire districts like the West End of Boston, or, you know, clear cutting, to borrow the metaphor, or to make a metaphor from the forests of parts of Manhattan, the alternative wasn't putting in amber the neighborhoods, but, you know, for instance, permitting the fourplexes into the neighborhoods so that you do get these kinds of mixed uses, but also not only not forcing all of density into very restricted corridors and territories, but also demonstrating that development, that, let's call it broadly speaking, modernization, can be experienced as a very positive phenomena. And that's, I think that's when I started by mentioning what I thought of as the kind of bipolar nature of the city. I was trying to get at this sense of, you know, like the pathology of the patterns of Toronto's development, which are creating a lot of the alienated feelings around the process of modernization. I mean, I don't know, I don't think this is related to that, but one of the audience questions is, many modernist buildings feel unwelcoming, for example, Robarts Library, and which I happen to love. Well, yes, as you know.
I disagree.
But yes, so do I, but I mean, I know that people feel that way, and, you know, you can't argue someone out of feeling a certain way, but I do think that in some ways, at least I have a sense maybe that some of the hostility towards what people think of as modernity or modernization or modern architecture has to do with the way in which it is associated with enormity. And what is like the alienating pattern of our bipolar city.
Just fix the landscape architecture.
Yeah, well, honestly. I mean that's what, you know, if you think of the tragedy of Ontario Place, I mean, the trees are, you know.
Update the finishes. Update the finishes.
Okay.
A lot of what makes these places uninviting is they're dreary in terms of their finishes and the furnishings, and it really has to do with the atmosphere of obsolescence, not with the fact that they are obsolete.
Okay, can I speak to this too? Because I went to U of T.
Yes.
And I can tell you, I'm not an architect, but I'm an end user of architecture, which means I go into buildings. And, and Robarts, even John Robarts, if you read his biography, he talks about he's driving with somebody in a car, with a friend in a car, and he says, see that library up there that's named after me? And he said, oh, really? And he says, yeah, it's the ugliest building in the city. Anyways, but right across the street from that is Innis College, which is where I went. And it's a small scale, but it incorporates, I don't know if you know it, but it incorporates like modern building with Victorian houses. And it's open and it's structural, and it felt like it's a small community. There's only 1,000 students at Innis College. That building really did create a community. It was on I think, a relatively small scale. Really beautiful piece of architecture.
Well, but I agree, and I think that incremental thing, and Shirley's colleagues at KPMB did Wordsworth College across the street, which is a very similar spirit, and that kind of modernism with a sensitivity to the urban fabric is not unique here, and it kind of was a debt to Philadelphia, but like that's a thing we really did here in a distinctive way. And there was an image of a building called York Square, the one with the circles on the side, that was floating around up here. And we need to look after that. But it also, you know, I mean, that came out of the office of Diamond Myers, right? In this, who did, right. So that's when,
Which is being incrementally improved now.
It's also being changed. But I mean, the architecture firm that did Innis College is, the ancestor of Diamond Schmidt, who are, not just doing the destruction of the West Island of Ontario Place, but vocally speaking out about its importance and alleged value as a public amenity. I don't know what Jack Diamond would have said if he was around, but like, there you see it, 180-degree return from the same company and the same people, from one sensibility, I would argue, to a completely different one. And I don't know what that says, but at some point, if the profession doesn't call out that kind of inconsistency or doesn't criticize that kind of change in ethos, then, which they aren't, then what happens?
It's just turned 9 o'clock. We were supposed to be done at 8:40, so.
People want to go home.
Yeah. I want to thank all of you for this discussion. I hope that it has been interesting for everyone out there in the audience who stuck with us until so late. And also to remind you all that we begin tomorrow at 9 a.m. There are going to be four more panels during the course of the day. The doors are opening at 8:30. There will be some late refreshments if you are the sort who want to get here at that hour. But thank you for coming today, and we look forward to seeing as many of you as you'd like to come tomorrow morning for the next round of discussion. So thanks again. Thank you all.
All right, Ken.
Oh, Aziza.
Yes, I just want to say thank you. And for those of you that are not going to be coming tomorrow, please keep one lesson in mind, hopefully from today. Those buildings need love, need care, need activism from architect and non-architect. And please also your votes for those that have a vision for the future of our city so that we don't lose a heritage that we cannot retrieve. Thank you very much.